My name is Bruce Ross. I'm a Brussels-based independent agri-food consultant.
Okay. And what's your presentation about today?
It's about the impact of Brexit on the UK pig sector. The UK, I think the biggest opportunities are, A, that the UK will now be able to devise its own agricultural policy, and there is an opportunity there for the pig sector if it convinces the government to have a pig sector policy that suits it better perhaps than the current one under the CAP. Secondly, leaving the EU gives the UK the opportunity to negotiate trade deals with third countries, which might open up new markets. But leaving the EU is going to make life more difficult in trading terms for the pig sector in very many ways. There isn't really one scenario that does not involve new difficulties. However, the UK has two big advantages. One, it is already a member of or is already following the EU's rules, and therefore doesn't have to come up to scratch, if you like. Secondly, the EU, the rest of the EU, also trades with with the UK. Therefore, both sides have an interest in coming to some form of mutually acceptable agreement. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me, and I'll move quickly on because we don't have too much time. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I just want to underline one thing, and that is the word independent. I work for myself. I provide independent advice. I don't tout the government line or any other line. So these opinions are my own. And then I want to add three things. One is that I haven't written it down here, but I would have voted Remain in the EU had I had a vote, but I've been living abroad for too long, so I didn't have one. Second thing is I'm a supporter of Liverpool Football Club, and as you all know, they have a very positive but realistic manager, and that is how I want to approach this talk, in a positive but realistic way. It's a huge subject, so I'm going to have to oversimplify, and I'm not going to cover some of the process issues. You can ask me questions later if you like. I just want to try to get down to the practicalities of what it all means for your sector. And I'll concentrate on the trade aspects of it because I think a British agricultural policy, BAP, is something slightly separate, though there are clear links between agricultural policy and trade policy. And in meeting the challenge that Mrs. May has set of a bolder embrace of free trade within the wider world, but also a close relationship with the EU. Now, just before I get talking about Brexit itself, I look at some of the very basic data. I won't go through these figures. Just the one thing that strikes me from this table is the self-sufficiency figure for British pig meat. We are clearly very closely linked with traded pig meat, and that is the case particularly with the EU. The UK is a key part of the EU pig meat market, and trade is critical to the EU market balance, as all of the pig meat that comes into the UK at the moment is from the EU. We're also crucial, if you look at it the other way around, to the market balance in the EU, and that's just looking at the total figures, but if you look behind that at particular cuts of pig meat, that is particularly true, and especially for middles. Therefore, whatever happens to the UK pig meat market will have an effect directly and indirectly on the whole EU market. And in addition to all of our pig meat imports coming from the EU, 70% of our exports are to the EU at the moment. Now, let's go on to Brexit, and just a couple of words of warning. The UK media, I feel, for many, many years, but it's also true today, has been painting a rather superficial, misleading, and sometimes downright dishonest picture of Brexit and everything that goes about it, and about the EU in general. And many politicians play the same game. Actually, that's true not only in the UK, but elsewhere. The EU gets blamed for many, many things. So I suggest that you check everything you read and you hear, including from me, because these are just my opinions, with other reputable sources, and rely on your industry bodies because they have your interests at heart. and will have done more research than your average journalist. Not talking about the journalists in this room, because they're obviously not average. And also, if you can, try to find, and you can do this with social media and the internet, try to find some non-UK sources to try to get a more balanced picture of what other people are saying about Brexit. Now, the point of departure is that the EU is a full member until it leaves. Well, that sounds obvious, but that means that everything that happens in the EU until March the 29th, 2019 directly affects us. And from that day forward, unless there's some sort of extension to our membership, which requires a unanimous vote in the Council, then we leave the EU on March the 30th. And we become a third country, and that's important to underline. We don't have some sort of special status as a friend of the EU. We become a third country just like any other, unless we manage to negotiate some special arrangement. The question is, where are we going to go to in terms of trade? Now, there are a number of variations on these themes, but it basically boils down to we either trade on WTO terms, or we have some form of trade agreement with the EU. And there's all sorts of question marks around that, about timing, when it all starts, how quickly we can make a deal with the EU, and a possible transition period from one to the other. And when you're considering all that, and the government here is considering all that, it also has to think, well, what sort of agricultural industry, what sort of pig industry do we want? And how will that fit into the Prime Minister's bolder embrace of free trade with the wider world? Because clearly completely free trade with the wider world has opportunities, but also great threats for any agricultural sector. Now, before getting into the actual trade deals, you must realize that whatever political decisions are being taken, the UK and the EU have an enormous amount of work to do just at a sort of bureaucratic administrative level. We need our own customs code in this country. We need to detach ourselves from the WTO as part of the EU, and we don't have to reapply, but we have to become a member in our own right. We have to submit our own schedule of commitments on tariff levels, on domestic support to our agriculture industry, and many, many other things. And the EU will have to, in turn, adjust all of its agreements under the WTO, if only to remove the words UK from, or the initials UK from any pieces of paper. So there's a lot of administrative work that has to go on. And most importantly, I think that in the agriculture sector, that involves dividing up the current tariff rate quotas, TRQs, that the EU has with a myriad of third countries. And when a customs union, as the EU is, changes, anybody who has a trade agreement with that customs union and loses some form of benefit from that customs union is entitled to be compensated for the loss of that benefit. Now, you may think, well, TRQs don't play a huge role in the pig meat sector, but they do in others, such as sheep meat. And if somebody like the New Zealanders or Australians loses access to the EU market for sheep meat, they say, well, we want compensation. Maybe it could be in pig meat. It's perhaps not the best example, but it's just to illustrate the point. So the first of the two main options is not talking about a free trade agreement. We go for the WTO option. That could arise either because the UK walks away from the table, this whole mantra about no deal is better than a bad deal, or the EU simply decides that it wants to trade on WTO terms alone and doesn't really want a free trade agreement with the EU. It'll find its trade agreements elsewhere in the world. Bear in mind how much of the pig meat sectors of the UK and EU are intertwined. But anyway, the UK can decide to do that if it wishes. The UK says it wants to be a champion of free trade. Now, can you trade on WTO? Can you have FTAs but be a champion of free trade at the same time? Well, they're not exactly mutually exclusive, but we'll see that they don't perhaps sit that well together. What does it mean to be trading on WTO terms only? Well, the UK would lose straight away the benefits of the existing FTAs that the EU has with third countries, and I think there's something like 57 or 58, and that's just free trade agreements. There's about 800 other agreements which are nothing, or not specifically and only to do with free trade. Can they be replaced quickly by the UK's own FTAs, and quickly? Well, they surely can be replaced. It's the quickly that's, I think, in question. The UK will, if it trades on WTO terms, have the right to impose its own tariffs, and it will face tariffs when dealing with the EU, when trading with the EU. But I don't want to talk only about tariffs, which a lot of politicians in this country have been doing. I think Peter Lilly, who's an ex-minister, once said, oh, we could do a deal on tariffs with the EU in 10 minutes. Well, I don't think that's true. But even if you could, there are non-tariff barriers to deal with, and they can be much more important even than tariff levels in preventing trade from actually taking place. And then there will be customs formalities which we haven't had to deal with in the last 30, 40 years, which we will have to deal with at some level in the future. And for products like pig meat, there could well be veterinary procedures to deal with as well, which again we haven't got to deal with at present when dealing with the EU. So if there was no FTA, the UK would pay a common external tariff to export to the EU. I'll give you an example of the range at which those tariffs could be applied to exports of UK pig meat to the EU. And I'm told that if there was a tariff on sow meat to Germany, and that is one of our major exports, then that market could be lost. Do we have a market for sow meat here in the UK? If not, what are we going to do with that meat? And I said there were a lot of tariffs. That is not even all of them. That's some of the tariffs on pig meat products that the EU currently has. And then there's all the border formalities that the UK could face as a third country, and I underline again, the UK would become a third country. We could face all of that and much more. And it's important to realize that currently we don't have very many physical inspections of, there may be paperwork, but we don't have physical inspections of many of our cargoes that go to the EU. But we could expect to have 20% of our red meat consignments being physically checked, unloaded, examined, put back in the lorry again. And in poultry meat, it's worse. And then there's all sorts of customs clearance formalities which must be gone through as well. Now, any delay is generally costly, and in pig meat, it could be worse than that. I give you further examples there of formalities which have to be gone through. I won't go through the slide in detail. But when you start to think about this in practical terms, it's much more than just paperwork, possible physical inspections. But imagine what lies behind that. If your lorries are delayed on a fairly regular basis, the time that it takes to have the inspections, show the paperwork, get clearance, it all adds up. And then you start to think, well, what are we going to do with the lorries while that's all happening? Where are we going to park them? If we have to store product, how are we going to do that? If we have live animals, where are we going to put them? Are there sufficient layerages? There's a whole sort of infrastructure behind all this, which currently doesn't exist. Now, I haven't verified all of these figures. I've plucked them from here or there from various sources. But this gives you an idea of the scale of some of these problems that we face. I mean, just go down to the penultimate slide. The UK only has 5,000 customs staff. France has 3 times of that, 3 times as many as that, and we're going to need more. We don't have enough already. And that could be the result. Now, I don't want to say that will be the result. That could be the result. And those people who say, well, if we don't get the deal we want, we'll just walk away, and they don't think there will be consequences. That is a possible consequence. Now, the alternative to trading on WTO terms is to have a deep and special partnership between the UK and the EU, as Mrs. May has put it. I think it's important to notice there's no particular template for free trade agreements with the EU or anywhere else for that matter. Each one is a little bit different from the other. The UK wants to have a specific and special one, but between it and the EU, and I think the EU does also want that as well. We haven't suddenly become enemies. We will not suddenly become enemies, and we have great dependence on each other for trade, so we will want to do a good deal. Good deals tend to take a long time to negotiate. You've seen all sorts of figures probably for the number of years which some of these agreements have taken. I think the one with the Mercosur countries started 20 years ago and it's still going on. Canada's was a little bit shorter than that, but then people didn't take into account the fact that there were already existing agreements such as veterinary agreements with Canada before the CETA talks even started. So some of these figures about numbers of years are misleading. And of course the EU and the UK already know each other. The UK already applies all the EU's laws. So that should shorten the time in which to negotiate a new agreement. Of course, that won't be easy if we antagonize each other. So the less we have of allusions to the Second World War, I think probably the better. What might an FTA with the EU involve? Well, they're not really free trade agreements. I know that's what it stands for, FTA. But what they really mean in agricultural terms anyway is involving the reduction, sometimes complete removal of all tariffs and duties, but there are always sensitive sectors which are exempted. Pig meat's not normally one of them. They're usually dairy, sugar, and one or two other products. And tariffs are only usually, for those more sensitive products, or even for the less sensitive products, the reductions in duty are only for a fixed amount of product. You don't necessarily in a free trade agreement get zero tariff and totally open access. And don't get caught up, as I said before, in the idea that if you remove tariffs, all your problems are over. In any FTA, the UK would still continue to have to meet all the EU's, as a matter of starting point anyway, in principle, all the EU standards. And they're dynamic, of course. They change over the years, and we've always had a say in how they change in the last 40 years, but in future, we won't. The Canada deal, CETA, is often held up as a great example of what we might aim for in the UK. But bear in mind, and this is a direct quote from the Commission's website, the European Commission's website on the CETA, all imports from Canada have to meet EU rules and regulations. There's no exemptions for Canada. They've still got to meet all the EU's rules and regulations. They've got an 80,000 tonne a year pig meat TRQ, and I don't think they're anticipating sending very much pig meat in the near future. There is some good news, because I said I did want to be positive. EU 27 businesses are very interlinked with businesses here in the pig meat, agriculture, and wider sectors. And I know from talking to your industry organisations in Brussels that the EU's meat trade wants the freest trade possible, frictionless as possible in the terminology that's used over here, because there is such independence between the two parts of the market. Another positive thing is that the UK starts, as I said, from the position of being a conformist with EU rules. It's not like Chile or Argentina, which will suddenly have to bring in all sorts of new rules. We're already there, and it's a question of how we use that to our advantage. So, but because we have that advantage, and because we have maybe some help from our colleagues in the EU 27, I think we do have the possibility to argue for less onerous border procedures, as much as possible anyway. We won't, I don't think, get the sort of trading conditions that we do now, because it's been made very clear to the UK that cherry picking is not on. We have to be seen to be doing more than we are currently doing in order to have access to the EU market. But we do have some of these positive arguments that we can use. But don't think you can do it by undercutting the EU's food safety standards. I think it's vital that we have a transition from EU membership to an EU-UK free trade agreement. It cannot happen overnight, and I don't think there's time even to negotiate such an agreement in the year and a half, two years, little less than 2 years that is remaining. So we've got to have some form of interim or transition. I think the government, the current government anyway, has recognized this, but they still don't like using the word transition. They've found other ways to express it, but I think it is realized that we do need some form of temporary arrangement. For how long, one doesn't know. Now, I've only looked at UK exports to the EU. Of course, the same thing happens the other way around. We're going to have procedures in place on this side of the channel, and we're going to have to decide what it is we want to allow in, bearing in mind the sort of industry in the pig meat sector that we want to have here. And that's just two of the possible options, which I think others have already alluded to. So, that's the meaning of Brexit as I see it for British pork. There will be changes. That doesn't mean they're bad changes. I think in the short term it will be very, very difficult, and certain things in the marketplace will change. But we do have possibilities outside. Now, one thing that I was asked to mention was welfare. I know that this pig meat sector in the UK has the highest, probably maybe the second highest welfare standards in the European Union. Sweden is possibly arguably higher, but that is a good selling point. But can we leverage this in trade? In the short term, the problem as I see it is that the WTO doesn't really legislate in this area. For many years, the EU, when we were having multilateral trade discussions, was trying to get welfare into trade agreements, but did not have any success. But perhaps we can do that in free trade agreements. But you've got to bear in mind that there are WTO rules about processing methods and how far you can use those in trade agreements. So perhaps a better way might be to use the labeling route and persuading consumers that our products are better than other products imported or otherwise. And remember, what we do to other people, they can do to us. So what do I conclude? I think the WTO trade scenario, the no deal is better than a bad deal scenario, is bad news whichever way you look at it. A UK-EU FTA would be better than the WTO scenario, but it still necessarily will have to be worse than the current situation in trading terms, because the EU must be seen to prioritize its remaining members and the single market over keeping the UK sweet. So what should we do? Push the UK government hard for a transition arrangement and be very specific. There's been a lot of words talked about Brexit, but very little that's specific. We don't really know what the UK government's position is in any detail. We've got a lot of slogans, but nothing much behind it. Well, we must bear that in mind ourselves and not just say we want a thriving agriculture sector and as open a trade system as we possibly can. We've got to say what we actually mean by that and get our partners to work with us on our behalf and be positive, but also be realistic amongst ourselves and then to people outside the pig meat sector. And don't poke the EU with a stick. It doesn't work. Now, there's a lot of things that I haven't mentioned, Labour, Ireland, whatever. You can ask me about those later on if you like. And that's doesn't mean just today. You could also email me or whatever. Forget Twitter, I don't know how it works.